Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute. Welcome to our weekly webcast with our president and founder, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. We're moving through a very perilous moment in history, which is, as in recent weeks, we've seen on the one side, tremendous opportunities, especially following the Trump-Putin discussion. But at the same time, we're seeing threats being thrown out from people like Pompeo, from Bolton, heating up the hotspots. And Helga, why don't we start with some of these hotspots, because these have the potential danger of launching wars by accident or intentionally. So maybe we should start with the Iran situation.
Yes, I think what Pompeo is doing and Bolton is really, creating a situation of potential devastating confrontation, which not only includes Iran, but, we always said in the past that, if it would come to a military confrontation with Iran, it does have the potential of escalating into a big war. Now, what happened was basically, that 1 year ago, people will remember that the United States unilaterally canceled the nuclear agreement with Iran, which was originally signed by the five permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. So the US withdrew. Then they increased the sanctions, which have made quite massive problems for the Iranian economy. And more recently, the US put the Iranian Revolutionary Guards on the terror list, which is, one thing to cause an escalation. Then Iran, in a counter move, put all the US troops in the region in Southwest Asia on a terror list. So that already means a complete powder keg. And now, basically, Bolton, in his capacity as national security advisor, which is really not his job, ordered this U.S. aircraft carrier and a whole bunch of other warships to leave the Mediterranean towards the Persian Gulf. So this is a high profile situation. Now, Iran, Rouhani responded to that. The parliament had a meeting and they decided that Iran would reduce its obligations according to this treaty. And Rouhani put a 60-day ultimatum to the Europeans to fulfill their commitments according to this treaty. Now, he claimed that the Europeans did not stand nor hold out the pressure coming from the United States. And that is absolutely true, because all the German firms which had invested in Iran practically withdrew, and most of the other Europeans as well. So, the Europeans definitely, despite their initial statements that they would, not capitulate, they did de facto. So the big question naturally is, what will they do in the next 60 days? And obviously, if Iran would go back to develop nuclear weapons, then this would be the complete pretext, for more moves. So this is really very, very dangerous. And I think this is definitely a neocon policy. Unfortunately, Trump seems to be on that line right now. The whole thing was also escalated when about 10 days ago, the national security team of Netanyahu visited Washington, met with Bolton's team, and that is where the line came from, that Iran is an immediate threat to the United States and its allies. Now, Pompeo, who was supposed to come, he was in Finland talking to the Arctic Council, where he made an absolutely unbelievable attack on China. I mean, really beyond the beyond, comparing it to the 30s, the implication that they're like the Nazis. I mean, really an unbelievable tone. And then he was supposed to come to Germany and meet with Merkel and Foreign Minister Maas. And he just told them he wouldn't come because of an international security matter without telling them what it was. Then he turns up in Iraq to put pressure on the Iraqi government because of Iran. And then the German government found out that he was in Iraq, and then he went on to Great Britain. Now, I think this is a kind of confrontational behavior, which for sure, I mean, it's not even clear that it was Trump who told Pompeo to not come to Germany. But this is the kind of behavior which really makes it very difficult. And I think Trump is not well advised to keep these neocons around him, because Trump has said repeatedly, he almost says it every day in some tweet, he wants to have good relationship with Russia and China. And then the entire intelligence community, which just was caught red-handed of having been in a coup attempt against his administration, they are coming out with this absolutely violent anti-China line. And the neocons in his administration, mainly Bolton, Pompeo, Pence to a certain extent, they are doing everything possible to heat up these crisis spots, so that any kind of serious policy for Trump is impossible. So I think this is an untenable situation, because either Trump succeeds in improving the relationship with Russia and China, and then every other crisis can be settled, or these neocons have the upper hand, and then the Trump presidency will not succeed what it set out to do.
And it was just announced today that Pompeo will be heading to Moscow next week for a follow-up meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. They met in Finland, and at least there was one hilarious scene where Lavrov was asked by CNN whether he and Pompeo discussed the problems of Russian meddling. And Lavrov said, well, I hear in the US you're called a fake news network, and that's a fake question. But these are very dangerous signs. We'll see what happens when Pompeo goes to Moscow. But as you said, this seems to be going against the general tenor of what Trump is doing. I think, Helga, the other thing that has to be seen in this context is that the war push is coming precisely at a moment that the people who are doing it are being exposed for their role in setting up Russiagate. There have been several tweets and news stories coming out. And why don't you take up this FOIA report, which shows again that Christopher Steele was at the center of operations long before the timeline that people have talked about.
Yeah, I mean, the British involvement in the coup attempt against Trump is now coming out more closely. And in light of that, before I go into this story about the new revelations, in light of that, I find it really incredible that, Trump tweeted several times that it was the British who were involved. And then Pompeo, following his visit in Iraq, went to Great Britain. He met with May and Hunt, and gave a lecture at the Margaret Thatcher lecture, in which he praised the special relationship with Great Britain, said it's vital, it's vibrant. He put pressure on, he put pressure on the British that they should not go with the Huawei G5 network. Hunt answered to that naturally the UK would do never anything which would be not in the interest of the Five Eyes colleagues. But to praise the special relationship with Great Britain at a moment when the British were caught red-handed in a coup attempt against the US president is really an incredible thing. And, the same goes for Biden, by the way, who made an unbelievable Freudian slip. He was at a fundraiser in Colombo in South Carolina, where he said that he got a call from Margaret Thatcher urging him to run against Trump. Then he realized later that, he had misspoken and said, no, it was Theresa May who called me. But this is incredible. Here you have Theresa May calling on a Democrat to run against Trump. And this is obviously completely in the line of the House of Lords report of several weeks ago, where they said that the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States would not survive a second term of Trump. So they are openly trying to meddle again and continuously in the inner affairs of the United States. And, I think this is really something absolutely unbelievable. Now, coming to this new revelations, this is really a bombshell because in an FOIA request, a conservative grouping got documents which prove absolutely that the Assistant Deputy Secretary of State under Nuland, I think her name was or is Catherine Kevelek, that she met in October with Christopher Steele. That is 1 month before the election and 10 days before Comey made this brief to the FISA court for the surveillance of Trump and the Trump campaign. So she met with Steele, and in this meeting, Christopher Steele made it very, very clear that he had political motives to basically manipulate the situation against Trump. Now, he demanded that the famous or infamous Christopher Steele dossier should be published before the election, obviously to smear Trump in the public view. So this is now coming out, and that is proof that the entire Obama administration knew what the character was of this operation. So even the Washington paper, The Hill, basically states that fact, that this is the first time that it's out with public proof. Now, this will hopefully have a big backfire effect because again and again, this is an unprecedented scandal in the history of the United States, and Trump has said that many times himself, and one can only hope that the consequences will be felt by those people who initiated all of this.
And we're taking an initiative now to make sure that the picture is clear. We're circulating a letter calling for William Binney, the former technical director of the National Security Agency, to appear before the Congress to expose the fraud of Russian meddling. I mean, Helga, you mentioned all the insanity that's going on. The Democrats and the Republicans continue to say that Russia meddled, that Russia's going to meddle again, that nothing's being done to stop Russian meddling. And this keeps getting in the way of Trump getting together with Putin. Now, one sign of a little bit of sanity from the Republican side were the comments from Mitch McConnell, which I think are something that you thought were fairly important.
Well, you have a situation which is clearly heating up for the 2020 election campaign. And you have the radical will of the wing of the Democrats, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's being pushed by the media as if she would be the most important thing. But more reasonable Democrats realize if they keep as the only focus the attack on Trump and impeachment and all of these things, that this may not go well with the voters. So Pelosi and McConnell, they basically say, it's time to move on and to work together on important issues like the infrastructure question and similar things. But, I think that the hysteria in the United States is really unbelievable in terms of, how brainwashed people can become when this party conflict dominates everything. And I think, the warning of George Washington at the end of his term that political parties are a bad thing is really true. And, bipartisan approach to the global challenges, which are massive, is really absolutely required, because otherwise there will be never any infrastructure being built. And, the new financial dangers are also hanging over us. So I think that this is really too much at this point.
And our viewers can go to the LaRouchePAC.com website and get a hold of this letter about bringing Binney to testify and organize. There are already groups that are going to congressional meetings with this letter to try and demand that this lie that's still there in the Mueller report be expunged. Now, Helga, the other really hot issue which is taking place today in Washington, Chinese delegation is coming in, but the whole thing became muddled when the president said the Chinese backtracked on their agreements, that there will be new tariffs as of Friday if there's not a full agreement. And this occurs as there's an escalation of the anti-China rhetoric. So how do you see this thing unfolding?
Well, I don't know what will happen, because the positive tone coming from both Trump and the Chinese of a couple of weeks ago has been unfortunately replaced. Lighthizer claimed that the Chinese took back some agreements, not referring to exactly what they were. The Chinese are trying to save the situation. Liu He, the chief economic person in China, is in Washington right now. But the Chinese Commerce Department also said that if Trump goes for these tariffs, increasing for 200 billion from 10% to 25%, and then he also said that there are another 325 billion he would consider to put new tariffs on. The Commerce Department said that they would answer that with countermeasures. Now, that obviously would really be a very bad escalation. And it remains true that, in my view, the most important strategic issue is, will the United States respond to the rise of China, which cannot be stopped by peaceful means? Will they try to contain China and cause a real strategic big confrontation? That would be a catastrophe for all of humanity. This has been stated also repeatedly in the Chinese media, that they regard the U.S. China relationship as the most important, because these are the two largest economies, and if they work together, it will be good for the whole world. If they clash, it will be a potential catastrophe for the whole world. So we have to see. I still hope that the original idea of Trump, who called, at least in the past, Xi Jinping many times his friend, who praised the great culture of China, that impulse will come through. But it seems the entire intelligence community in the United States is on a yellow peril rampage. I mean, we talked about that last week, but I want to state it again, that the unbelievable report by this Karen Skinner, who is the director of the policy planning group in the State Department, she had this unbelievable diatribe calling, China the first non-Caucasian nation confronting the United States, which is a little bit funny coming from an Afro-American woman. But, it's the same idea of, the Chinese are an inferior grouping, and as I said, this goes back to the old yellow peril scare of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. The Chinese Foreign Ministry answered very strongly to that, and also Global Times, by basically saying the State Department seems to be governed by an ideology which China used to have 2,000 years ago, when people thought that everything not being China were barbarians, but that China has overcome such a backward view since a very long time, but the State Department seems to be still on that line. Now, I think this is really a very dangerous situation, because, if you look at the overall dynamic in the world, you have the new paradigm being centered around China's Belt and Road Initiative, which China keeps emphasizing is a force of great good in the world. It's a gift from China to the whole world, because it offers a win-win cooperation to all other countries. And the fact that there were 150 nations at the Second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing a couple of weeks ago, attests to the fact that all these countries see it in their own interest to participate in this new paradigm of cooperation. And the geopolitical factions of the Western world are trying to contain that. And, I don't think it will be possible, at least not in any peaceful way. I mean, all of Europe is moving in the direction of the new Silk Road. Even Chancellor Merkel, who was very slow on the learning curve concerning the new Silk Road. She was recently in Hamburg. She met with a school class visiting a modern terminal in the Hamburg harbor. And she praised the new Silk Road as a very positive initiative. So I think, there is clearly motion in the direction of reason and cooperation and overcoming geopolitics. But I think, this anti-China hysteria, which is being fueled by the same forces who were involved in the coup against Trump, obviously are trying to poison the well and poison the atmosphere. And I can only again reiterate, people should not fall for such propaganda, but they should form their own opinion in looking what is China doing actually in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, and why are these countries all saying that China is fulfilling something which the West for decades did not. So, overcoming poverty, overcoming underdevelopment. So I think it's really important to take off the geopolitical spectacles because they can only lead to a disaster.
And hand in hand with the geopolitical spectacles is neoliberal economic policy. And we were talking before about this report, and I don't know if I have the figures accurate, but there's something like 648 millionaires working at Deutsche Bank, which had its stock fall to about $7 a share in the last couple of days. So the whole question of the economy is directly connected to this whole geopolitical question. The people who are pushing these wars are the same ones who are saying we have to stick with the old paradigm, the neoliberal economics, the austerity, the World Bank, the IMF, those old rules, and the China's breaking that. So Helga, it really does bring up the issue of what is the real solution, that yes, geopolitics has to be overcome, but there's also an economic side, and that's very much connected with the life work of your husband.
Well, what you mentioned, the Deutsche Bank, is really a real outrage, because if you have 643 millionaires, employees of Deutsche Bank, the richest one, or the one who made the most money, is a guy called Garth Ritchie, the head of the investment banking department. He made 8.6 million in 2018 alone. Now, that is why all the shareholders lost a lot of money. And, these are all the derivatives traders who make that amount of money. And I think this requires a Pecora commission, because, this kind of excessive profit making at the expense of the common good, that is what exactly was investigated by Franklin D. Roosevelt with the Pecora Commission following the big crash of the 30s. And a new crash is hanging over our heads like an imminent danger, and could be triggered by a whole number of developments. So I think, we should really restate where we are. The U.S. economy is not in the best shape. I mean, you cannot go by the stock market. My late husband was warning many, many times that, that if you go by the stock market, this is a complete illusion, and you have to look at the real economy. And the real economy in the United States is in terrible shape. I mean, you have the homelessness. I mean, there are these videos out in Seattle which are horrifying. The homelessness in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, the condition of the infrastructure, tunnels breaking in, bridges being not safe. And, the United States needs urgently, like most European countries, a completely different approach. The austerity policy in Europe has led to a situation where the Greek population has been completely impoverished. The structural reforms imposed by the EU, in Greece, the pensions were cut for most people by 60%. Now, this is robbery. This is absolute theft. And the EU Commission is defending that. We are just involved in a specific case where a Greek ambassador protested to the EU Commission by demanding that his cuts be compensated, and the EU Commission answered in a long letter that this was all for the good of the Greek economy. Now that's completely nonsense. If you look at the real living standard of the population, the poor people, the people who are thrown out of the middle class, has been increasing as a result of the neoliberal paradigm of the last decades. So what we need in Western Europe, but especially also in the United States, is the exact implementation of the 4 laws proposed by Lyndon LaRouche many years ago. Glass-Steagall, and there was an interesting comment, by the way, in CGTN, the Chinese international TV network, of a Western economist who said the economic problems of the West and of the United States are not due to China, but they are due to the repeal of Glass-Steagall and what that caused to happen in the 2008 crisis. And I think this is a very important point. So we need to go back to Glass-Steagall. We need to have a separation of the banks. The state has to protect the commercial side of the banking system. The derivative traders and the speculators have to take their losses without having access to taxpayer money. Then you need new credit institutions because there will be not enough liquidity. You need a national bank in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. And then you need an international credit system, a new Bretton Woods system, to provide long-term, low-interest credit for international projects and investments in the United States and other European countries, naturally in developing countries as well. And then you need a crash program for fusion, for space cooperation, to increase the productivity of the economy. You need this entire package. And I think that, we need more public debate about that. And, I think that, people are so confused by secondary issues, but, the real population wants to have a security about their future. This was the reason for the Brexit vote. This is what is behind the Italian situation, the new government there, which is already in place for a year or so, but they were voted in because the EU policies were rejected. This is the ongoing fight in France with the yellow vests. And this is why a bipartisan concentration on such a recovery program in the United States is the only chance. So, I think it's really up to you, the viewers, to, mobilize around these questions and make pressure on, the political landscape, the Congress, create the environment that Trump can go back to his intention, because he has said many times he wants to build the infrastructure. But, with the kind of hysteria which is being hyped up by some parts of the Democrats, the neocons in the Republican Party, and the mainstream media, it makes it very hard for him to do this. So we need a public debate and intervention. So this is why you should join with us, become a member of the Schiller Institute, get in contact with us, and get active, because it's our future which is at stake.
I think that's a very clear summary of the situation. And as we see the neocons and the neoliberals going crazy, the thing they fear the most is that Trump will go with something along the lines of Lyndon LaRouche's 4-power agreement for a new Bretton Woods, which would end their paradigm. So Helga, thanks for joining us this week, and we'll be back next week.
Well, we will put out a new pamphlet, which I want you to focus your attention on. This is on the exoneration of my husband. This is a very important document because it goes in the absolutely unbelievable violation of all laws in the United States. This is the worst case in the history of the United States, as Ramsey Clark said repeatedly. It has all the endorsements from around the world and condolences when Lynn died. So if you want to really get a sense of, what has gone wrong in the history of the United States and what is required to remedy it, namely to join the fight for the exoneration of my husband, please get to our website, get this pamphlet, and help us to distribute it as widely as possible. Join the campaign for the exoneration of my husband, because this is the best you can do for yourself, the United States, and the world.
Okay, and with that, now we'll see you next week.
Okay, next week.